For decades, scientists told us a comforting bedtime story about ourselves. They said that once humans invented medicine, built cities, and learned to grow our own food, evolution basically stopped caring about us. We had outsmarted natural selection. We had escaped the brutal rules that shape every other living creature on this planet. That story just got obliterated. A team of researchers analyzed the genomes of nearly 16,000 ancient humans, and what they found proves the exact opposite of what we believed for generations. Human evolution did not slow down after we built civilization. In some ways, it sped up. If the idea that your own DNA might still be changing faster than scientists ever expected doesn't give you chills, I don't know what will. Smash that like button right now, because this discovery is about to completely change how you think about your own biology. This research comes from a team led by scientists at Harvard Medical School, working out of what's known as the Reich Lab, alongside collaborators from the Broad Institute of MIT and Harvard. The study, published in the journal Nature, represents one of the largest analyses of ancient human DNA ever conducted. Researchers gathered genetic information from an almost unbelievable 15,836 ancient individuals, spanning roughly 10,000 years of human history across West Eurasia, the broad region covering Europe, the Near East, and parts of Western Asia. To put that number into perspective, earlier studies attempting similar work were often limited to a few hundred or maybe a couple thousand ancient genomes. This new data set dwarfs almost everything that came before it. And when you have that much data, you start to see patterns that were always there, hiding in the noise, simply waiting for someone with a big enough data set and the right tools to finally notice them. If you appreciate just how massive an undertaking this was, make sure you've hit subscribe, because the actual findings are even more shocking than the scale of the study itself. It's worth dwelling for a moment on just how geographically and historically sprawling this data set really was, because the scope is part of what makes the conclusions so hard to argue with. The nearly 16,000 ancient genomes analyzed in this study didn't come from one isolated region or one narrow slice of time. They span an enormous stretch of West Eurasia, covering everywhere from early hunter-gatherer populations roaming the landscape before farming ever existed, all the way through the dramatic population. Upheavals brought on by the spread of early farmers out of the Near East, and later the sweeping migrations of steppe ancestry populations moving in from the East. Each of these major demographic waves brought its own distinct genetic background, its own diet, its own disease exposures, and its own environmental pressures into the mix. Earlier studies working with only a few hundred ancient genomes simply couldn't reliably tell the difference between a gene becoming more common because an entire new population migrated in carrying that gene already, versus a gene becoming more common because it was actively helping people already living there survive and reproduce more successfully. With close to 16,000 genomes spread across this entire timeline, researchers finally had enough statistical power to tell those two very different stories apart with real confidence. If you're impressed by just how much sheer data it took to finally answer a question this complicated, drop a like before continuing. This kind of large-scale ancient DNA research doesn't exist in a vacuum either. It connects directly to a separate, equally fascinating thread of human origins research that's been unfolding at the same time, involving where modern humans actually came from in the first place. Recent genetic analysis comparing diverse present-day African populations, including some remarkably distinct groups like the Nama people of southern Africa, against the existing fossil record, has challenged an even more fundamental assumption many of us grew up believing, the idea that every modern human descended cleanly from one single unified ancestral population somewhere in Africa. Instead, that research suggests early humans likely emerged from several distinct, intermingling populations spread across the African continent, populations that began genetically diverging somewhere between roughly 120,000 and 135,000 years ago, yet continued exchanging genes back and forth with each other for an extended period rather than splitting apart in one clean, decisive break. Put these two lines of research together, the ancient origins of modern humans as a tangled multi-population story rather than one tidy point of origin, combined with this new evidence of accelerating natural selection continuing to reshape our genomes for the past 10,000 years, and a much bigger picture starts to emerge. Human evolution was never a single clean event that happened once and then stopped. It has been a continuous, messy, ongoing process from the very beginning, all the way through to right now. If that bigger picture genuinely changes how you think about human history, subscribe to this channel because we're only scratching the surface of what's being uncovered. It also means the story of human origins itself looks far less like a single decisive moment and far more like an extended overlapping negotiation between separate populations spread across an entire continent, gradually becoming the species we recognize today while never fully losing contact with one another along the way. Let's also talk about some of the other specific traits this research connects to actively selected genes, because the sheer range is honestly remarkable. Beyond immune function, skin pigmentation, and disease risk, researchers found evidence of selection acting on genes tied to behavioral tendencies, the kind of underlying genetic variation that can subtly influence things like temperament or stress response. Though scientists are quick to caution that behavior in humans is shaped by an enormously complex mix of genetics, upbringing, culture, and personal experience, never by a single gene acting alone. Skin pigmentation in particular has become something of a textbook example in this field, with earlier, smaller-scale research already confirming that lighter skin pigmentation was strongly selected for as ancient populations moved into higher latitude regions with less direct sunlight. The biological logic behind that particular shift is well understood at this point. Lower sunlight exposure at higher latitudes reduces the body's ability to naturally produce vitamin D through the skin, which in turn affects calcium absorption and overall immune function, creating real evolutionary pressure, favoring lighter skin capable of absorbing more of the limited available UV light. Earlier research identified a handful of specific genes responsible for most of this shift, including genes with names like SLC24A5 and TYR, among others. This new, much larger study builds on exactly that kind of earlier work, but multiplies the scale by orders of magnitude, revealing hundreds of additional selected genes across dozens of different traits that earlier, smaller studies simply didn't have the statistical power to detect. If you're starting to appreciate how each new wave of research builds directly on the last, like this video right now, there's also a genuinely important cautionary note buried inside this research that deserves serious attention, especially given how easily findings like this can be misunderstood or misused once they leave the scientific community and spread across the internet. The researchers themselves have gone out of their way to clarify that none of this data suggests any particular modern population evolved to become inherently smarter, healthier, or biologically superior to any other population. Genetic variants connected to traits like educational attainment or household income in modern statistical databases reflect complex, modern, culturally shaped circumstances, not some kind of ancient evolutionary verdict about innate human worth or capability. The entire concept of formal schooling, for example, didn't exist during most of the 10,000-year period this study covers, which means any modern correlation between a gene and educational outcomes almost certainly reflects something else entirely, some other underlying biological function. The gene also happens to influence rather than evolution, somehow predicting or favoring modern academic success thousands of years in advance. Misreading this kind of research in that direction has a long, deeply troubling history, and reputable scientists are extremely careful to push back hard against that kind of misinterpretation every single time it surfaces. If you appreciate scientists being this careful and responsible with data, this sensitive, drop a comment below saying so, because that kind of caution matters enormously. For years, the dominant assumption in evolutionary biology went something like this. Once humans developed agriculture, started living in permanent settlements, and eventually built complex societies with medicine and surplus food, the harsh, unforgiving pressures of natural selection that shape wild animals simply stopped applying to us in the same way. Technology and culture, the thinking went, had essentially insulated our species from evolution's grip. If you could cure an infection or guarantee a stable food supply, your DNA supposedly no longer needed to keep adapting and competing for survival the way it once did. This new research absolutely shatters that assumption. According to lead researcher Ali Akbari and senior author David Reich, the data shows that natural selection didn't fade away once civilization arrived. It accelerated. The rate at which beneficial or harmful genetic variants spread through the population actually increased after farming began, not decreased. If that completely flips what you thought you knew about your own evolutionary story, drop a like on this video right now, because we are just getting started. So how exactly do you prove something this dramatic using nothing but ancient bones and teeth? This is where the real scientific breakthrough comes in, and it has almost nothing to do with discovering some sensational new fossil. It has everything to do with brand new computational methods. Ali Akbari developed a powerful new technique specifically designed to separate genuine signals of natural selection from all the other messy, confusing forces that can change how common a gene is in a population over time. Things like migration, when entire groups of people move into a new region and bring their genes with them. Things like population mixing, when previously separate groups intermarry and blend their gene pools together. And things like simple random chance, the genetic noise that naturally occurs in smaller populations, regardless of whether a gene actually helps or hurts survival. Untangling true natural selection from all of that background noise has always been one of the hardest problems in evolutionary genetics. Akbari's method finally cracked it wide open, and David Reich himself praised the technique, saying it allowed the team to zoom in specifically on the patterns that actually mattered. If you love it, when brilliant new math quietly solves a problem that stumped scientists for decades, hit that like button before continuing. Here's where the numbers get genuinely fascinating. Even with this powerful new method in hand, the signal of true directional selection turned out to be remarkably faint. By the team's own estimates, natural selection accounts for only about 2% of all the genetic changes they observed across this entire 10,000-year window. The other 98% comes from all that background noise we just talked about: migration, population mixing, and pure random chance. At first glance, 2% might sound almost insignificant, barely worth mentioning. But here's the twist that makes this discovery so important. 2% of an entire genome, tracked relentlessly across 10,000 years and tens of thousands of ancient people, still adds up to an absolutely massive amount of meaningful genetic change. Using their refined methods, the research team identified 479 specific gene variants, scientifically called alleles, that show strong, undeniable evidence of having been actively selected for, or selected against, throughout West Eurasian history. 479 individual pieces of your genetic code, each one quietly pushed in one direction or another by the relentless pressure of survival and reproduction. If that number alone doesn't surprise you, wait until you hear what some of these genes are actually connected to. Subscribe right now if you want to keep uncovering secrets hidden inside your own DNA. Among the traits connected to these 479 selected gene variants, researchers found strong links to immune system function, skin pigmentation, behavioral tendencies, and a wide range of other biological characteristics. Many of the specific genetic variants identified in this study are also tied to complex health conditions we still grapple with today, including elevated risk for type 2 diabetes. Think about that for a moment. Some of the exact same genetic variations quietly shaping your risk for modern diseases, like diabetes, may have been actively selected for or against by your ancestors thousands of years ago, for reasons that had absolutely nothing to do with diabetes itself, since that specific disease concept didn't even exist as a survival pressure back then. This single detail completely reframes how scientists think about modern disease risk. Many of the genetic fingerprints buried inside conditions doctors diagnose and treat today were never actually selected for the reasons we associate with them now. They were shaped by entirely different ancient pressures tied to surviving famine, fighting off infections, or adapting to a completely different diet than the one most of us eat today. If discovering that your risk for modern diseases might trace back to ancient survival pressures blows your mind, smash that like button right now. It's also worth noting that this research opens up an entirely new avenue for studying specific historical events through the lens of genetics alone, almost like reading a detailed diary written in DNA rather than ink. Because the researchers could pinpoint roughly when certain gene variants began rising or falling in frequency, they could start connecting those shifts to known historical and archaeological events, like the spread of farming into new regions, major disease outbreaks, or large-scale migrations, already documented through other forms of evidence. This creates a powerful kind of cross-verification, where genetic data and traditional archaeological evidence can confirm or challenge each other, strengthening our overall confidence in both fields simultaneously. Imagine being able to look at a single gene variant and trace, with reasonable scientific confidence, the exact several hundred-year window during which it became advantageous somewhere in ancient Europe or the Near East. Then matching that timing against known historical events, like the introduction of dairy farming or a documented ancient plague. That level of precision simply didn't exist before datasets reached this size. If the idea of reading specific moments in human history directly out of ancient DNA sounds like something from a science fiction story rather than real modern research, comment below, because that's genuinely the direction this entire field is now heading. One of the most striking findings buried inside this massive dataset involves exactly when this acceleration of natural selection actually kicked into high gear. According to the research team, the pace of directional selection noticeably increased after the rise of farming. Before agriculture, small bands of hunter-gatherers lived a particular kind of life, with particular dietary patterns, particular disease exposures, and particular environmental pressures. Then, starting roughly 10,000 years ago, depending on the specific region, everything changed almost overnight in evolutionary terms. Humans began settling permanently in one place. They started eating diets dominated by a small handful of cultivated crops instead of a wide variety of foraged foods. They began living in close, crowded proximity to domesticated animals and to each other, dramatically increasing exposure to entirely new infectious diseases that simply didn't exist in the same way for smaller, more scattered hunter-gatherer populations. Each one of those massive lifestyle shifts created brand new evolutionary pressure almost instantly, and the genome responded. Genetic variants that may have been neutral or even mildly disadvantageous during the hunter-gatherer era suddenly became extremely valuable once farming reshaped how humans lived, ate, and got sick. Comment below if you've ever wondered how much of your own biology might still be quietly adjusting to the agricultural revolution your ancestors lived through thousands of years ago. Now, before you start assuming this means certain modern populations evolved to become smarter, healthier, or somehow biologically superior to others, the researchers themselves are extremely clear that this interpretation would be a serious misreading of the data. Just because a particular gene variant correlates with a trait like household income or years of formal schooling in today's modern society does not mean that variant was originally selected for that exact reason thousands of years ago, since concepts like income and formal schooling obviously did not exist in the Stone Age. The original survival advantage tied to a given gene might have looked completely different from how that same gene manifests in the modern world. The researchers use a great example involving red hair. Maybe having red hair offered some genuine specific survival advantage roughly 4,000 years ago, perhaps related to vitamin D absorption in low sunlight environments. Or, just as likely, the gene for red hair may have simply hitched a ride alongside a completely different, more biologically important trait that was actually driving the selection, with red hair just along for the genetic journey as a side effect. Scientists call this kind of complicated overlap pleiotropy, when a single gene quietly influences multiple, sometimes completely unrelated traits at once. If untangling that kind of genetic mystery sounds like detective work disguised as biology, like this video right now, because that's basically exactly what it is. There's an even more striking example of this genetic complexity that researchers love to point to, and it perfectly illustrates why interpreting these results requires extreme care. Consider the well-known gene variant connected to sickle cell disease. On the surface, that variant looks purely harmful, since carrying 2 copies of it causes a serious, often debilitating blood disorder. But scientists have long understood that the very same genetic variant also provides significant natural protection against malaria, one of history's deadliest infectious diseases, particularly throughout regions of Africa and the Mediterranean, where malaria has historically posed a constant lethal threat. So when researchers detect evidence of selection acting on a gene like this one, it becomes genuinely difficult to know, without much deeper investigation, whether ancient populations were actually being selected for malaria resistance, or whether the disease risk itself was somehow the more directly relevant evolutionary factor. This single example perfectly captures why the research team insists that finding a genetic signal of selection is really just the very beginning of the scientific story, not the end of it. Drop a comment below if learning about this hidden trade-off between sickle cell risk and malaria resistance is something you'd never considered before today. David Reich himself has emphasized just how much richer and more textured this research makes our understanding of human genetic diversity in history. According to Reich, this kind of detailed selection data offers an incredible opportunity to genuinely appreciate the sheer complexity behind human variation, both throughout history and in populations alive today. Rather than viewing human genetic differences as simple, isolated traits, each shaped by a single straightforward evolutionary pressure, this research reveals an almost impossibly tangled web, where ancient diets, ancient diseases, ancient climates, and ancient migrations all interacted simultaneously, shaping the genetic code each of us carries around today, often in ways that are far more intertwined and far less obvious than anyone previously assumed. If you're starting to see your own DNA as a kind of living historical record rather than just a fixed biological blueprint, subscribe to this channel right now, because there's a lot more to uncover. It's also worth understanding exactly how researchers managed to pull off an analysis this enormous and this precise in the first place, because the underlying technology driving this entire field forward deserves real recognition. Over roughly the past decade, the techniques scientists use to extract usable genetic material from ancient bones and teeth have improved dramatically, transforming what was once an incredibly difficult, failure-prone process into something far more reliable and scalable. What began as a painstaking effort to sequence the genome of a single ancient individual has now exploded into routine, analysis involving tens of thousands of ancient genomes at once. This explosion in available data is precisely what allowed researchers to finally separate true natural selection from confounding factors like migration and population, mixing with genuine statistical confidence, something that simply wasn't possible with the smaller, far more limited data sets available even just a few years ago. Each new ancient genome essentially adds another data point to an increasingly precise, increasingly detailed map, showing exactly how, when, and where specific genetic changes occurred throughout human history. If you're amazed that ancient teeth and bone fragments can now reveal this much detailed information about our evolutionary past, make sure you've smashed that like button. So what does all of this actually mean for how scientists think about being human going forward? If natural selection truly never stopped shaping our species, and if the data now clearly shows it may have even accelerated rather than slowed down after the rise of agriculture, then many of the traits we casually think of today as simply fixed, permanent features of human biology, things like disease susceptibility, certain behavioral tendencies, or physical characteristics, may actually represent moving targets rather than settled evolutionary endpoints. Human evolution isn't some ancient, completed chapter safely locked away in our distant past. According to this research, it's an active, ongoing process, one that has continued reshaping our species' genetic code right through the agricultural revolution, right through the rise of cities, and quite possibly continuing to reshape us in subtle ways even today. The researchers themselves have pointed out that these same computational methods could eventually be applied beyond humans entirely, potentially helping scientists understand how natural selection shaped domesticated animals like cattle or chickens, or how various species are currently adapting to rapid, ongoing changes in global climate. Comment below if the idea of evolution as an unfinished, ongoing process, rather than ancient history, changes how you think about your own future descendants. Step back for a moment and really sit with the weight of what this discovery actually represents. For most of modern history, we've comforted ourselves with the idea that human ingenuity had essentially won a permanent victory over the harsh, unforgiving forces of natural selection. We built hospitals. We built farms capable of feeding entire civilizations. We assumed that meant evolution's grip on our species had finally loosened, perhaps even released us completely. This sweeping new genetic analysis proves something far more humbling and far more fascinating. Evolution never let go. It simply adapted alongside us, finding new pressures hidden inside our own civilization, our own diets, our own crowded cities, and our own newly invented diseases, then quietly continuing to reshape our genetic code exactly as it always has, stretching back across millions of years of human and pre-human history. Every single one of us alive today is still walking, breathing evidence of a process that never actually stopped. And based on what these researchers have found, it may never stop at all. The next time you think about who you are, remember that your DNA isn't a finished product. It's a constantly evolving work in progress, shaped by 10,000 years of farms, cities, plagues, and survival, with the next chapter still being written right now, inside every person currently alive on this planet, including the descendants who haven't even been born yet. If that thought changes how you see your own existence, like this video, subscribe to this channel for more groundbreaking discoveries like this one, and tell me in the comments, which part of this story surprised you the most, because the story of human evolution is clearly far from finished. And the next major discovery could be sitting in a lab right now waiting to rewrite this story all over again.